Good afternoon. Welcome to the Macquarie University Liberal Club Sunday Sessions podcast, live from the Facebook main page. My name is Andrew Kremen, and I'm joined as always by my co-host Rory O'Connor.
Hey, how's it going, legend?
I'm good. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Today we will be covering the Religious Discrimination Bill. The Assistant Director of the Centre of Public and Contextual Theology at Sturt University, Jonathan Cole, is here with us. He's also the author of the book Christian Political Theology and an Age of Discontent. Jonathan Cole, welcome.
It's great to be having this conversation with you both and your audience.
Well, thank you for being here. As always, you can put questions to Jonathan in the comments section below, and we'll try to get to as many of them over the course of the hour. Firstly, what is the history of religious discrimination in Australia, and how has it changed over time?
That's a great way to begin the conversation, because it turns out, if we look back, that religious discrimination in some form has been both present and an issue right back to the settlement of the country in 1788. And that's because we were settled by the United Kingdom, and the original settlers they sent out here were from a range of different Christian traditions. We had Irish Catholics, we had the dominant Anglicans, who were the governors and the sort of elite of the various colonies that sprung up. But we also had a fair number of dissenting Protestants or nonconformists, namely Presbyterians, Baptists, Methodists. And it just so happens that at the time Australia was settled, there was quite widespread legal discrimination against certain denominations in the United Kingdom, against those groups I just mentioned. So there was all kinds of formal legal discrimination against Catholics in the United Kingdom, but also to some extent against the dissenting or nonconformist Protestants. And so here you have this community starting to spring up in Australia, and it's already religiously diverse, at least in the sort of British sense of different Christian denominations. The one thing they didn't do was establish the Anglican Church or replicate any of that formal discrimination. But because the Church of England was the established church in the United Kingdom, and because the colonies were run by London, and the governors they sent out were Anglican, there was a privileged position for the Anglican Church. And of course, the settlers brought with them many of the religious prejudices that they had back home. And so in the first fleet, there was a chaplain on it, but it was an Anglican chaplain. And when they arrived, they had compulsory church services, which meant for the Irish Catholics that they had to go to this Anglican service. And it was the Catholics and those dissenting Protestants really had to effectively fight for their rights before the British would allow, Catholic clergy to come out. And then right throughout Australia's history, up until more recent times, what you have is a history of sectarian conflict, which manifests itself in different social, cultural, and political contexts and issues that flares up around the question of school education, with the Catholic Church being heavily involved, and equity between the different faiths. And one of the interesting things about Australian history, if you go and look back at this, and historians like Stephen Shabura have really looked at this, the term secular, right up until well into the 20th century, has a religious connotation. And it means, in the context of education, a Christian education that is not sectarian. So neither Catholic nor Protestant, or specifically Presbyterian. A secular education was an education where people were taught the sort of morals and culture of Christianity, but we avoided those sectarian conflicts. And then, of course, the sectarian issue, it flares up around the conscription question in World War I. It manifests in political divisions. So most of the various liberal parties that you get in the first half of the 20th century, before the Liberal Party of Australia is founded, of the Menzies variety, these are generally Protestant political parties, and there's a fair dose of anti-Catholic prejudice in them. And then, of course, the Catholics gravitate towards the Labor movement and the Labor Party. And so, if you had have asked an Australian or a British subject living in one of the colonies, back in the 19th century, or even in the earlier part of the 20th century, what does religious discrimination mean to you? They would have thought of some kind of sectarian, Protestants being prejudicial or discriminatory towards Catholics, and perhaps vice versa. Now, the huge change that has happened really comes about after the 60s. And if we just fast forward to today, the entire context of this religious discrimination issue is just radically different from the history of religious discrimination. There are no longer Catholics firing Protestants or Protestants firing Catholics or looking over them for promotion. I'm not even aware of cases of different religions, Muslims trying to take Jews to court and vice versa. Now, when we look at particularly the issues that have brought about this whole legislative, what has turned out to be a bit of a farce, but this piece of legislation that has been on the agenda and which has bipartisan support, at least for the notion that some kind of legislation in favor of or to protect religious freedom or guard against religious discrimination is necessary. It's all about the non-religious taking religious people, predominantly Christians, but it could potentially be Jews and Muslims, pursuing them or complaining to various regulatory bodies, might be a professional regulatory body, or to the various human rights tribunals and commissions that all the states have, and that's a very complex network. And so now the context, not just in terms of the caseload that has driven this whole debate about religious discrimination and the need for the legislation, but if you like the cultural context, the perceptions of certainly religious believers is that the threat is coming from an increasingly hostile, secular culture and society, and people, not all people, but certainly conservative Christians, whether they're Catholic or Orthodox or Protestant, possibly conservative Muslims and Jews, now live in fear of activists who are not religious themselves and are not members of these faiths, or at least active members of these faiths, taking action against Christians or Christian institutions and organizations, businesses, because of their religious beliefs through the various mechanisms that exist. So if you compare that particular context to the religious discrimination of the United Kingdom at the time it settled Australia, it's gone through quite a radical transmogrification, just to pull out the wankiest word I can think of.
So from what you've said, if Australia has such a history of, religious observance, most countries around the world, or particularly in the West anyway, seem to have some sort of religious discrimination act of sorts. In Australia, we have a Racial Discrimination Act, Sex Discrimination Act, Age Discrimination, and a Disability Discrimination Act. Why don't we have a Religious Discrimination Act?
That's a really good question. I think there's a few ways to look at this. I think because that context I spoke about that underpins the current debate about religious freedom and religious discrimination, two concepts that get rammed together. Mind you, because that is new, I think there wasn't existing, when some of those acts went through, you look at the Sex Discrimination Act, that's 1984. No one was talking about religious freedom back then. I don't think it was even a particularly big or significant issue for a lot of religious believers that far back. So one simple answer is it's just a new issue, because the kind of context I'm talking about, I did mention the 1960s just as a kind of origin point. And the thing I neglected to mention is that that's when church attendance starts to go into sort of rapid decline. But the sort of religious discrimination, if I can use that term, not in the abstract, but as a social phenomenon, that is much, much more recent. That's like a decade or two. And so that's one reason we haven't got it. And I think another reason is historically, religious freedom, at least in Australia, which has this kind of anachronistic secular narrative that we tell ourselves and we project back. Because if we go back to even the early, I think there was a census in the 1920s that has the Christian population at something crazy like 96, 97%. So at least socially and demographically, Australia is a thoroughly Christian country until much more recent times. And so we don't really have a history of thinking of religion as a right. Now, in other contexts overseas, it has long been thought of as a religious right. In fact, as you probably are well aware, in the Declaration of Human Rights, it is named as one of those rights. I think that document goes back to the 40s, if I'm not mistaken. So partly as a consequence of our history, partly as a consequence of the secular myth or legend, if I can put it that way, that we tell ourselves, that we project back, earlier than the 1960s. You know, Australia was sort of this unique secular country that was founded amidst this world of religious superstition. And because it is actually very new, and so we're trying to grapple with a new right, and there's a conflict, if you like, because those who have fought for other rights, the rights of, you know, LGBTQ rights, it's a struggle for anybody that has sort of participated or supported for that right to wrap their head around the idea that religion might be a right, because in certain ideological views of the world, Christianity is an oppressor sort of system per se, misogynistic, transphobic, homophobic, crusades, slavery, colonization. There's a whole list of bad things that can come off. And so the idea that these bigots have a right to express and articulate their faith, I just think is very discordant and shocking and bizarre for a lot of people. I've experienced this in my personal life when I talk to friends and colleagues who aren't religious and don't have any kind of tangible knowledge or experience themselves. And I'll start going on about Israel Folau and this and that. And then when I break down the issues, you know, they've just never thought of it before. And so I think it's for all those reasons, it's kind of a hard sell in a way, because it's difficult to make people understand the key thing, which is you know what ultimately is religious freedom. It's really just it's all of the other freedoms combined: freedom of conscience, freedom of assembly, freedom of movement, freedom of speech. That's what we mean when we talk about freedom of religion. And it's just to make sure there's not an exception for all of those freedoms. So you're free to speak as long as you don't say marriage is between one man and one woman. You're free to assemble as long as you're not having a conference on gender dysphoria that is unaffirming. And so the difficult sell, I think, for those such as myself who actually think this is an important issue, it's not to say it's simple, there's a lot of complexities that come with it, is to try and make people understand you can't really have all these free individual rights and not religious freedom, because it is integral to all of those freedoms you actually believe in and like. And I think often it's the case that people just haven't actually thought about it in that way. And you can actually help them to understand the logic. But I have to say that the entire public discourse about this is very distorted and misleading. And so if you watch, say, the ABC, you'll think this is an issue about Christian schools wanting the right to expel trans kids. That's what it's been boiled down to. People don't actually understand that is not unimportant. It's clearly related to this question, but that is like focusing, if you like, on, I mean, this is a horrible, I can't think of a better sort of analogy off the top of my head, but it's like trying to describe a body by just talking about the thumb. It's a part of the body, but there's a lot more to it than that.
Yeah, if I can follow up on some of that, I remember Kevin Rudd in an interview mentioning that that Australia is a secular country. You know, I've heard the arguments before that secular countries are in essence superior to Christian ones. Would you sort of you know, being devil's advocate, could you name me a secular country from the 20th or 19th century that was superior to some of the good Christian countries of that time?
Well, I'm not sure I can, because I really don't believe in this concept of a secular country. You can certainly have a secular regime. You know, the Soviet Union, North Korea, China are secular regimes in that not only do they not have a kind of state religion, but they're kind of hostile to religion, and they see religion as a kind of security problem. But not only are there Christians in China, it's growing like you wouldn't believe. There are more Christians in China than the whole population of Australia. So in what sense is it even China a secular country? So this is what I say. So Rudd says Australia is a secular country. If that is just one half of a binary where the other one is theocracy, then okay, we're a secular country like 98% of the countries in the world. There's really only a handful of theocracies: Iran, maybe arguably Saudi Arabia, which references the Quran in its constitution and says that all the laws have to accord with the Quran. But even there, it's a kind of hybrid system. So arguably, Iran is really the only theocracy I can think of today. And so I find that a pretty useless distinction. What we really should be talking about is not whether a country is secular or not, but talk about the place of religion in it. So in Australia, based on the best stats we have, which admittedly aren't great, but for the best we have, about 1 in 5 Australians attend a religious service at least a couple of times a year. That's about 6 million people. There's 2.5 million people that go to a religious service every week. There's another 2 million that go sort of every couple of weeks. There are millions more that attend a Christian school or might go to a Christian hospital or have some kind of contact with a Christian charity, because it's the Christian churches that run the vast majority of welfare services in this country. So what's Rod talking about? I mean, the churches are responsible for a massive part of our education, the majority of our welfare services, some of our hospitals. He himself was a professed Christian prime minister, and we've had quite a few in this secular country, haven't we? We've got a Pentecostal prime minister running this secular country now. We've had a couple of Catholic prime ministers running this secular country. We had the Anglican Rudd running this country. So I think this term, this is why I call it a secular myth, because it's code for kind of irreligious, but that's just absurd once you start to look into the details. So really we should dispense with that category. And in academia, the whole, they've moved on to the post-secular now. They're no longer talking about the secular, but that's a whole nother debate. Really, we should just be talking about the role of religious institutions in country X and the rights, freedoms, obligations, duties, constraints of religious believers in that country. I mean, for goodness sake, we're here having a conversation about legislation that was just before the Parliament called a religious discrimination bill. So how secular is Australia?
I think that's a good point. I know Cardinal George Pell, in a talk in the US recently, was mentioning that he rejects the term post-Christian or post-Christian society. He thinks there's significantly more influence in society by Christians than people give it credit for. Why do you think a religious discrimination bill is being proposed now?
I think, look, this is a theory I have. I don't know for sure, but I think it really goes back to the Israel Folau episode. And the Israel Folau episode was the highest profile episode in a series of much lower profile episodes that through the networked worlds, particularly of Christians, were well aware of. I think what happened with the Folau was a real game changer, and that led to concerted lobbying efforts by certain religious organizations, and the current government, the coalition, was amenable to that. And it just so happens, this is the extraordinary thing, even though this legislation in one sense is depicted as the most contentious bit of war to ever be discussed in this country, it has bipartisan support, because after the Bill Shorten loss, for reasons I'll speculate about shortly as I build this speculative edifice, I think they got a shock at that loss, and they feel like they have a religious problem. And I've had some experience of this myself, being questioned by a Labor senator at a parliamentary inquiry, actually. And so I think even that the fact that the Labor Party, its official policy right now, in spite of the legislation just going down in flames, is to actually, their promises will actually legislate something in this space, reflects this. So what has happened is, for maybe, perhaps not even 10 years, but let's just say 10 years, unprecedented cases of what Christians would regard as discrimination have arisen, and they're really poorly known and understood. They don't get any media attention at all. But anyone who's interested can go and look at something called the Human Rights Law Alliance, which is a sort of law firm set up by the Australian Christian Lobby. And why was it set up? They didn't have one until relatively recently, because these cases just started appearing, and people were asking for help from the ACL, and they realized they needed some sort of legal expertise. So what kind of cases am I talking about? You know, there's a case of a student at a university who, and people just don't believe this because it sounds so crazy, but he was disciplined and suspended for praying for another student. There was a little bit more to it than that, but in effect, that was it. There was a Christian couple in WA, and this has been litigated, and there's a judgment pending. Approached the foster agency and wanted to be foster parents for kids aged 0 to 5. And when the social workers came round to chat to them, these are all cases from the last couple of years, the social workers sort of asked them about LGBT stuff. They said, look, you know, I think they said something, I'm paraphrasing, you know, we believe homosexuality is a sin, but we have to love and respect gay people. Look, you know, we wouldn't reject a child that was gay, but, you know, presumably there'd be some way that you might want to put them with a family that's sort of better suited. And they were denied. Now, stress, they were going to foster kids 0 to 5. And they were declined because, quote, they had an unsafe household. And that has gone all the way to litigation. There's a sort of photography business, husband and wife team, and they've got a sort of traditional Christian view of same-sex relations, I guess you could say. And it's kind of interesting because in a way this feels to me unnecessary, but they were very open with people. You know, they weren't a Christian organization per se. They're shooting photos for atheists and Muslims, whoever, I'm assuming. And so they were open with people that, look, we'll shoot a gay wedding, but this is our view, and we just want you to know, to give you the option to go and choose if you'd be more comfortable with someone that was more supportive. And a gay couple tried to use their services, and to cut a long story short, lodged a complaint with whatever the Equality Commission is in WA, and put them through 8 months worth of process before they withdrew the complaint. Now, a lot of conservative Christians know about all of these cases, and that's just a fraction of them. And so when they see a high-profile footballer lose his career for, okay, he paraphrased the Bible, but for doing something that a lot of people would think was something he did in his private life, presumably we're all entitled to a private life, we have freedom of speech. I think the non-religious part of Australian society just still does not comprehend that when he lost his job and all these people hammered him, he lost it for articulating what I would estimate at least a couple of million, or at least more than 1 million Australians believe. So what do you think those million Australians thought when they see all of these cases? And are like, well, if I'm a doctor and a family comes in with a trans kid, and I say my recommended treatment is to start with some counselling, rather than the current sort of reflexive uncritical affirmation policy, which puts them straight into the process of transition. I can assure you they are thinking twice. And I even beyond the cases, I know people who feel they have to be extremely careful. It's happening at schools, particularly in the health profession, academia, those kind of areas. And so the problem is, in a networked world, all of the Christians that hold these views know about these cases, and the majority of Australians have no idea that this stuff is happening. And so the whole reason it's happened now is that various Christian groups have lobbied the crap out of the Morrison government to try and do something. And this is why I say the debate's very misleading, because I don't want to harp on this, but the debate is really framed around whether schools should have the right to expel gay kids, trans kids, and or fire or not hire gay or trans kids. And that is an issue. That's one of the very complex parts of this. And that's where the sort of conflict that brought down the bill that was before Parliament, it was centered around that. But for the many Christians, I have to apologize to people of other faiths because I'm just not as across what's happening in the sort of Islamic and Jewish context in particular. But they want to basically stop activists targeting their jobs and putting them through human rights tribunals for simply articulating what was, in some cases, the law only a couple of years ago, and has been the traditional teaching of the Christian faith for about 2,000 years. Now, that I'm not saying there's no complex issues there to be worked out. It's not straightforward in terms of how do you match religious freedom with other freedoms and rights in a diverse society. But I think a lot of conservative Christians feel, with some evidence, that there's, all the focus is on them and what they want and need, but the debate's missing the other side, which is targeting people of religious faith. And they can do that because there is no protection. And they're very vulnerable, particularly more so in certain professions, like the ones I mentioned. And this is a new caseload, and it's growing like really, really fast. So that's a kind of long explanation, but a detailed explanation of why now.
Yeah. As a quick follow-up from that, in your opinion, are religious schools just dying to be able to expel gay, transgender students? Is something that they're really looking to do? Because I feel like what you were saying, that the portrayal is that if that is allowed, suddenly you're going to have tens of thousands of students being expelled. In your opinion, is that something that would likely happen?
That's a fantastic question. I'm glad you asked that. Certainly, I don't get a sense that Christian schools are dying to do it. I'm not a legal expert, but from the commentary I've read, they allegedly have the right to do that right now. That's why Labor moved the amendment to the Sex Discrimination Act that ultimately brought down the Religious Discrimination Bill, which in itself is one of the curious complexities of this, that a bill that passed the lower house with Labor and Liberal support ultimately went down because of a change that was proposed to another piece of legislation, that 1984 Sex Discrimination Act. And I believe that clause, the clause that allegedly gives, I say allegedly because I don't know, that gives the right to schools right now to fire trans and gay kids, was, from what I understand, legislated by the Labor government in the Rudd-Gillard years. Look, if the Christian schools and their representative bodies have consistently said publicly that they don't do this and they have no desire to do this, I would be cautious in saying there's no school that wouldn't be inclined to do that based on a certain teaching they have. We did see the whole brouhaha over the City Point school in Brisbane with the quote unquote contract that they sent to parents, which seemed to be setting up for exercising that. But given the ABC's obsession with this particular thumb of this much wider, more complex issue, I would have thought we'd have heard from a lot of gay and trans kids expelled from schools if they existed. And again, I don't want to overstate it. I mean, maybe there are some and they don't want to talk, but wouldn't you think they would have lifted under every rock to try and find some kid or the parents of some kid they could put on? And so this is why I say it's a massive distortion and distraction. Again, I don't want to say it's not an issue, because clearly it's a serious question, and it's worth having the public debate about that and and it does relate to the legislative question. But it seems to be, if I could put it like this, the concern, one of the primary concerns from opponents of the bill or the very concept of religious discrimination, because there are voices that say it's just not needed, full stop. Their concerns seem to be primarily hypothetical on this specific question. And so, like, just to sum that up, people need to think about this. The schools, or at least their representatives, are saying, we're not interested in this. It's hard to find any example of people that have been expelled. That's not to say they don't exist, but it could hardly be a flood if we can't find anyone. I'm sure the ABC and some other media outlets have looked, and it seems by some accounts that this legislation already permits that, in which case that in a way seems to bear out what the Christian schools are saying. I mean, if they have the right to do it right now, you'd think they would be exercising it. So it's a very curious, I mean, I get in terms of culturally, it's sensational, and when you see every politician get up, they get hammered on this question. It makes for good TV viewing in the eyes of those who seem to think aggressive interviewing makes for good TV, which is not me, but that seems to be what we like in Australia.
You mentioned that the change to the sex discrimination bill is one of the reasons why it was is one of the reasons why it didn't pass in the Senate. There was withdrawn support from Dominic Perrottet, Fred Nile of the Christian Democrats, and the Australian Christian Lobby. And in the end, the government removed it. Why do you think the Conservative support has changed? Is it exclusively this, or are there other reasons?
No, look, I think it's all a little murky. It's a little difficult to get a precise handle on what happened, because I take it there were a lot of machinations. It was a very fast-moving, messy process with lots of surprises. But the account I've heard that sounds not only plausible but compelling to me is that and this is the story from conservative Christians who have been lobbying for this change. That account is that the Prime Minister panicked once it became apparent that some of his own so-called moderate Liberal members would cross the floor, that he offered as a kind of sacrificial offering to remove that part of the Sex Discrimination Act, which wasn't on the agenda, because usually when the Parliament considers a bill, they're not trying to make changes to 100 other bills. And what that would have done in this account is end Christian schooling in Australia. That's the claim. Maybe that's a little overwrought, but I think there's a lot of truth to it, because what they're thinking is, okay, I mean, I should just one fact that people need to understand is that particular section 38 of the Sex Discrimination Act, as I read it, and as some commentators have pointed out, is mainly about hiring, which is quite a different issue from the expelling of students. So you have a Christian school, let's say it's set up by Pentecostals, and it's set up perhaps by a church, and it's set up to teach a particular Christian view of the world, so that Christian parents can send their kids to a school where they'll be taught the Christian sexual ethic, amongst a whole bunch of other, theological, ecclesial, whatevers. Now, there is an exception at the moment, which is widely used right across Australian society, which allows a kind of discriminatory hiring in institutions where, if you like, some kind of belief is integral to the very purpose, mission, and establishment of the institution. So in the case of these Christian schools, that exception to the Sex Discrimination Act says they don't have to hire a trans activist if their teaching is that there are only two biological sexes and you can't change your sex. Much in the same way that the Labor Party is not forced to take some alt-right white supremacists just because they're the most qualified, because that would completely undermine everything that the party stands for. So they thought if this ability, if the schools could no longer hire staff who supported the mission of the school, then in effect, that, if you like, would lead to sort of downstream to the demise of Christian schools. The reason I say that's a little different is I actually think it's possible to take a position that comes down differently on both the student question and the hiring question. So the two aren't necessarily tied. So it's one thing, I think there is a strong case, for example, for Christian schools not being forced to take, a Dawkins-loving militant atheist just because they have postdoctoral qualifications in education and have the most experience of all the math teachers coming on. I think even an atheist, if you sort of push them, could probably see the absurdity of a legal system that forces, people. There's this, the same goes for priests and clergy. Like, that would be just as absurd as forcing an LGBTI support group to take some right-wing Christian who thinks gays are all going to hell. Like, there has to be some fundamental right for institutions, if you're going to let them be established for specific missions, to hire staff that are supportive of the mission. That's quite a different thing for the kids, because particularly if you start a Christian school and you have an open enrollment, as City Point does, that's quite a different thing to fire a student who has maybe been there since kindergarten and then at age 16 presents with gender dysphoria and then wants to start presenting as a different sex. I think that raises a kind of wisdom pastoral question that's a bit different from the hiring. And personally, I think my solution would be to not actually expel kids in that situation, but to make it clear to the parents that they're not going to alter their teaching. A bit like the Christian couple with the photography, and to say that, look, we're not an affirming school, and so we will accept the kid, we'll treat them the same as everything else, as everyone else, but our teaching here is probably going to be a bit at odds at what perhaps you want your child to know. And then there's a wisdom question for the parents, because it's not like there are no affirming schools in Australia. There are a dime a dozen. So you can find a school that's, including some Christian schools, incidentally, that are more progressive in their values, that will be very supportive. Because if you force them to change the teaching, then really they're not Christian schools anymore. And people who take that position, and some do, in my view, should be transparent and just come out and accept and say, we think we should really abolish all religious-based education in Australia, from the Muslim school to the Jewish school. Where do Jewish Orthodox kids go to? They go to a Jewish Orthodox school. Why? Well, their parents want to instill in them a certain mode of living that really is quite out of step with what you're going to get at the public school down the road.
Would this bill have stopped Israel Folau from being fired by Rugby Australia for professing his beliefs on social media?
I don't know for certain, but this is just my read based on the commentary, and actually I've read the legislation. The dispute there really hinged, from what I understand, on contract law, because he was terminated for a breach of contract. I believe that was the rationale, and the whole dispute was about whether his post was in violation of the contract and how far a contract can extend into your personal activities and a whole bunch of other stuff like that. And I'm conscious that some months ago, as you both may have read, there was this debate about the so-called Israel Folau provision of this legislation, and the Prime Minister and all the cabinet chose not to go with it, which also tells me that this particular piece of legislation wouldn't have stopped it. That said, there is another way of looking at this, and I think the successful passage of some religious discrimination bill. And even this one, if you listen to conservative Christians, none of them are completely satisfied with it, but they all think it's better than nothing, or they did at least before they started messing with the Sex Discrimination Act and threatening, as they understand it, the very existence and future of Christian schools. I think it would actually potentially have a cultural impact. I think it would actually embolden Christians, not to get all aggressive necessarily, but just reassure them that it's okay actually to say in the staff room at a school, I can't participate in this particular activity because it violates my conscientious sort of objection based on a belief. At the moment, that is very fraught and potentially dangerous, actually. And so it would also send a message to the so-called secular society as well, that the government, particularly if it's bipartisan, has actually enshrined to some extent this right to religious freedom. And it might make the activists have to think twice about the kind of attacks they make on certain Christians. And the activists this is a small minority we're talking about, but that is the new phenomenon that is really driving it. And just to round that off, underlying this new activism, unprecedented activism, is a new cultural situation that also is quite unprecedented, where basically anyone my age, say in their 40s and under, maybe even 50s and under these days, there's now a large pool of Australians that are completely ignorant of religion. That is, there are people who don't even know the most basic story of Christianity, what Christians believe. They don't know what goes on in churches. They're completely unaware of the prominent role that Christian institutions play in the country. They're ignorant of our religious history and the way that theology and religious ideas and religious institutions have shaped the kind of culture that we and institutions, the sort of political institutions that we have. And so when the activists, they pull out, they find the crazy Christian who sort of articulates something that a lot of Christians believe in a kind of aggressive way, or they make these claims about harm, they're not equipped to know otherwise. And everyone wants to do the right thing. And so like, whoa, okay, we don't want to see any trans kid harm. So if Christian schools equals transphobia, then clearly there's a problem with this religious discrimination stuff. Completely unaware of any of sort of 98% of the issues we've discussed here in this conversation. That's not to say they would support it, but what I'm saying is that the world is very easily poisoned by the activists in a context where people just don't know. So the short answer to your question that I could have started with is I don't think so.
Yeah. Well, from my understanding, so what's happened with the bill so far is that after these amendments were made and adjusted, it did still pass the lower house, and then it was moved to the Senate. But then both the Labour Party and the Liberal Party decided to not have it appear on the agenda for that sitting time for the Senate, which makes it look likely that it won't be debated on in the Senate until after the election. So I have two questions. One, do you think the failure of this bill to pass and the quality of the bill, do you think that'll affect Scott Morrison's successful chances at the election? And number two, what do you think the future of this bill will look like if, as you've said earlier, that Labor actually supports it, as a concept, if not how it is right now?
Let me walk backwards. So on the Labor point, the honest answer is who knows, but it's going to be very intriguing. I say it's going to be very intriguing because whilst they are publicly committed to passing some version of a bill, and I mean, they did, after all, I mean, this just gets a bit lost in the debate. I mean, they supported the version of the bill just with some minor amendments through the lower house. It's hard. We have no idea exactly what it's going to look like. And there's reason, I think, to be just a little bit skeptical. And I say that based on an interview I saw on Insiders about a week ago with Christina Keneally, where she had to sort of argue and stand by the Labor talking point that they think there is a need for a religious discrimination bill, and she was trying to defend the idea, basically what I said earlier, that Christian institutions, including schools, there's a compelling argument for them having the discriminatory hiring ability that I spoke of. But she looked incredibly unconvinced, unenthusiastic, and almost embarrassed to have to support that. That makes me wonder what the real conviction in the ALP is. And this allows me to bring in the point I foreshadowed earlier, but didn't actually unshadow, if that's the way to say it. And that is, I suspect after the 2016 election, I think the ALP probably got some reliable research that showed that moment that Bill Shorten went after Scott Morrison for his faith was very damaging, including in Labor seats. I think Australians generally, whilst I think the majority of people are not actually anti-religious, I think Australians have a sort of let live. You know, if you want to believe in some weird superstition, go for it, as long as you don't bother me. It's the same attitude that ends up sort of pro same-sex marriage. Also, I think reacts when people really start hammering someone on the basis of their faith. So the reason I say that is, this is just speculation, but I suspect the ALP realizes there's an electoral weakness there and a problem if they're seen to be weak on religion. But I get the sense that this is tactical, not conviction. So I think it's more a political problem that they feel they need to address. I mean, Christina Keneally is a practicing Catholic with some theological training, which is presumably why they trotted her out. So it's not like she's some militant atheist, but she looked like she wanted to be anywhere else defending any other piece of legislation than this. And so that does make me question the level of conviction, and I will be watching out to see if what we get is some insipid, watered down thing that technically ticks the box of, you know, we passed something on religious discrimination, but it's unlikely to please the Conservatives. On the electoral question for Morrison, again, difficult to say. There's a lot of disenchantment on the right, including the religious right, if I can use that loaded term, when it comes to the coalition. A lot of it's to do with vaccine mandates and the way the whole pandemic has been managed. And now you put on top of that this failure to get the religious discrimination legislation done, and probably a concomitant fear that the ALP, much as I just speculated, are going to be weak on the issue and maybe not actually do anything. So I expect a lot of votes to go to independents and minor parties to the right of Morrison, but those preferences are unlikely to flow to Labor and the Greens. So I think there's a potential. I think a lot of those votes will still find their way to the coalition when all is said and done. But in some seats, you only need a small percentage to not flow, you know, those doing the sort of classic protest vote, to not feed their vote ultimately back to the coalition. And it could make a difference in a couple of elections, and it could be really tight. But then the X factor is, you know, do some of those religiously conservative communities in places like Western Sydney, which are not all Muslim, but they're often Middle Eastern Christian and other Christian migrant communities, do they in any way pin this on Labor? Probably not, but it's a bit of an open question. We'll find out.
We've got a question here. It says, in America, there's been a growing backlash from conservatives like Sohrab Ahmari and Adrian Vermeule against Enlightenment, claiming that it couldn't conserve the religious culture that the country was embedded in. Since Australia and the West have become more secular, how far do you think liberalism as a political philosophy has come to protect religious liberties?
Look, I think classical liberalism, in a way, is where religious freedom begins. You know, you can go back to Locke's famous writings about religious toleration. So, in my view, I mean, I'm politically conservative, but I'll be the first to acknowledge liberalism here, the tradition of liberal thought. is really where religious freedom, religious toleration, religious pluralism begins. It's not with conservatives, because they have a more normative view of religion. Some religions are wrong, some are right, and often it ends up my version of my religion is right and your version of my religion is wrong. And I've always been a strong believer that what conservatives ought to be working towards in our society and culture, and here I'm speaking as a Christian conservative, this group that sort of feels the religious freedom discrimination question, is we need strong liberal institutions, because I don't want to live in a theocracy. So I want a level playing field and an open contest where I have just as much right to participate in public debate on any issue. The problem is, I think the left, or certain, I think it's hard to, I'm generalizing here, but a part of the progressive left has left its erstwhile attachment to the liberal framework behind. So they've become like very illiberal now, just like the most illiberal right-wingers that they allegedly despise. So now, rather than having an open contest of ideas and people sharing their freedom and even perhaps having a robust argument or discourse, if you say something they don't like, and let's face it, it's getting to absurd levels now, they will hound you out of existence. They will try and make you lose your job, your career, your livelihood. They'll try to get you deplatformed. And so, given liberalism is under threat from the left, and there's also a threat from the right, let's be honest, as a conservative, I recognize that the future of my ability to live and have the freedoms as a sort of theologically conservative, politically conservative Australian citizen, I need a strong liberal order, actually. And it's the liberal order that's really under threat now, not some mystical conservative Christian past or nation. The fight now is about liberal institutions and liberal ideas, and conservatives depend on them for their future. And I would say actually everything from the future of Christian schooling depends on this liberal order. But I think a lot of conservatives fail to recognize that the thing that the left is really undermining and attacking is not some putative Christian nation. It's this liberal order where people are free. They have freedoms of speech, conscience, assembly, right. That's what's actually under threat in very difficult circumstances, in my view.
I've just looked at the time now, and I'm afraid we just have gone over time just a little bit. I'd like to thank everyone for watching. I've been your host, Rory O'Connor. My co-host has been Andrew Kremen. I'd like to thank you so much, Jonathan Cole, for coming on this evening. You've been fantastic.
I had a blast, and thank you for the opportunity.
No worries. Hopefully we can have you come back on again in the future, perhaps. We'll see what the update is on the bill moving forward. This has been Macquarie University Sunday Sessions. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.